Another response I get to the idea of the state breaking down and the welfare state breaking down is that it will create eye-watering inequality, that the rich will get massively richer, they'll clean up and grab everything, and the poor will be left with nothing. No, wrong answer. I think the reverse is the case. I think it is the welfare state which is largely the cause of a lot of the social inequality that we see these days. I think that happens in three ways. Firstly, by rendering people dependent and atomized, so that state authorities can shaft you. And secondly, by forcing governments to adopt methods which increase or substantially increase inequality. And thirdly, by incentivizing people not to look at methods which would in fact reduce inequality. Now, firstly, the welfare state, particularly universal non-means tested benefits such as incapacity benefit or the rise of single mothers to the top of the housing queue, those things seem to correlate very closely with inequality. James Bartholomew, in his book The Welfare State We're In, he links the rise of, he calls the 1970s the pernicious decade, because that was the decade in which those universal benefits largely came into being, and he links those benefits with with the rise of mass unemployment, which had never been a feature of British society before, and were a permanent feature of British society after the 1970s. Theodore Dalrymple is more funny about it. He says that incapacity has created more invalids than the First World War, and on the numbers he's right. So, but the 1970s, it's certainly that is, or the inequality graph correlates very closely with the universal benefits graph. There's a very close correlation between the two, and I think that's because inequality and welfare, particularly universal welfare, they correlate very closely. See, you're not going to get greater equality through the welfare state. And anyone who tells you you're going to, like Owen Jones or Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn or the World Economic Forum, which just so happens to be made up of all the big businesses, the biggest businesses in the world, with their great reset, calling for more redistribution through taxation and welfare. I wonder why they don't seem to be afraid of it. Those huge, great conglomerates don't seem to be afraid of it. Telling you that welfare spending is going to create greater equality. Anyone who says that is either lying or just a fool. The welfare state is over a century old, and we are more unequal than we've ever been. Now, this links into a nationalist argument that I sometimes hear, which is that free trade is it atomizes and isolates people. It dissolves the bonds of solidarity between people. That it is the other side of the coin from Marxism, i.e., an internationalist fraud. Morgoth, the vlogger, I think, if I interpret him rightly, I think he has said he would like to see a return to pre-capitalist society, and perhaps what he means by that is a return to what Evelyn Waugh very eloquently, very skillfully referred to as the harmonious interdependence of rich and poor, of dignity, innocence and tradition. Now, I hope I'm interpreting Morgoth correctly. If I'm not, well, I apologise to him, but I think that I don't agree with that. The reason I disagree is because I think it is the welfare state that is creating that inequality, and that is dividing people, that is dissolving those bonds between people, that is melting interdependence between people. And whereas free trade, I think, unites people. It gives people an incentive to pool their differences and to cooperate, because neither side is worse off. They each end up better off. Something is created as a result of it, so everyone benefits. The sum of wealth gets greater because those two people have cooperated, and that gives people that incentive to be interdependent. On the other hand, I used to find it strange. Many decades ago, I used to listen to people who had been hard up before World War II, talking about how, yeah, we were poor, but we stuck together. I just found this very strange. Why is that compensation for being so poor? I think I understand it now as people saying that this was an asset, this solidarity, this mutual dependence between us. This was an asset that rich people couldn't have and couldn't understand, but we had it in abundance precisely because we were poor. Now, I am not saying poverty is a good thing. It's not. It's a bad thing. But that solidarity, that sticking together, that is a good thing. It's something people like and enjoy and feel affirmed and valued by. My point is that it is welfare that destroys that. And you can see that amongst welfare-dependent populations. Amongst welfare-dependent populations, a man is much more likely, several times more likely, to be seen as completely unnecessary, a distraction, sometimes a welcome distraction. Maybe you get bored with him, he becomes an unwelcome distraction, so you kick him out. But not someone who is necessary, someone you can or should rely on. And it dissolves those bonds even within families, and certainly between families, between people in society generally. Secondly, another way in which welfare and inequality go together is that reliance on the state gives a lot of power to the state. It makes you more manageable, more dependent, and that means the state can shaft you by doing things like by putting in place measures like mass immigration and money printing and feminism. These are all things that make the poor poorer and the rich richer, and the bulk of the population just much more easy, more docile, more sheep-like, more easy to control. And to a certain extent, the welfare state forces governments to print money, to engage in money printing, because governments make welfare promises in order to get elected. They need to pay that welfare, so they need money to do it. They need to increase the tax take. The quickest and fastest way to increase the tax take is to create economic boom. And the quickest and fastest way to create economic boom is to force money into the economy, to push money into the economy, to try and to pump up the economy, to create that economic boom. And that money printing forces money into the economy. That money printing eventually finds its way into assets like shares or bonds or house prices, i.e. things that rich people already own. It makes rich people richer. And that money printing, on the other hand, dilutes the wages of the poor, makes their wages fall in value or rise more slowly than they otherwise would. So the welfare state indirectly creates or increases inequality very substantially through the massive money printing we're seeing at the moment, and we are going to see a massive rise in inequality, in wealth inequality right across the world. You wait for it. It's already started with the rise of the tech stocks and the big firms like Amazon or Google or Facebook, just going. They're going to go even more stratospheric. Now, but the third reason why I think the welfare state militates against inequality, militates against equality and in favour of equality, is that it prevents people from looking at and taking up the methods which genuinely would reduce inequality and create greater equality within society. And the main method that I have in mind here is employee ownership. If you want greater equality, I'm not absolutely convinced that people do. I think equality is a good thing and would be a good thing. I think it would make people's lives better. I'm not certain that all that many people are that concerned about it. I suspect people do want it a bit, but there isn't people are not calling out for it, they're not crying out for it. But if you do want greater equality, the method to achieve it is through employee ownership. Employee ownership does three things. Firstly, it spreads ownership of wealth creation, of the means of production, and it reverses the constant pressure, the pull towards concentration of ownership of the means of production. Currently, a big shareholder in a company, he has an incentive to get more shares in that company in order to get overall control, total control of that company, which is very valuable to him. In an employee-owned company, a share in the hands of an employee will be much more valuable than in the hands of a majority owner, because a share in the hands of an employee will motivate that employee to make that business more profitable, more successful. So in that way there will tend to be an incentive, a pull to distribute shares more widely, or for shares to be owned more widely in the hands of employees, reducing the concentration of ownership of the means of production. Now, the second thing that employee ownership does is to reduce or get rid of isolation, atomization, between and division certainly between employees within a company, because employee ownership forces people to take their pay out of the same bowl, i.e. the profits of the company. And in that way it forces employees effectively to work for each other, to become very mutually interdependent, because you're no longer paid the way you are today, which is sucking up to the boss, getting him to pay you and perhaps give you a pay rise as an individual, and to hell with what your colleagues get. You depend on your colleague to increase the pool of profits every much as you depend on your own efforts to increase the pool of profits out of which your pay comes. And that increases Evelyn Waugh's interdependence between people. I think that is a good thing. I think that is a nice thing. That would be a beneficial thing for people in their everyday working lives, in our everyday working lives. Now, the third thing that I think employee ownership does is to reduce the size of businesses, because the motivating effect of employee ownership doesn't really work in big companies, because if there are 1,000 employees, if you're sharing those profits with 1,000 colleagues, you don't really see the rewards for breaking your back to make the place work better. There isn't. Your efforts are diluted, so that incentive gets diluted out. But as long as a business is no larger than about 7 or 10 people, then your efforts do not get diluted out of existence, and you have every incentive to encourage your colleagues to put in more efforts, because you will see the results of that in your pay. And that is an issue these days when the concentration of wealth is so great. What I read is that the FANG stocks, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, I think Netflix and Google, that they account for, well, the estimates I read are between 15 and 20% of the entire stock market. That is one huge cartelization of the economy between just five companies. That's a problem. I'm talking to you on YouTube. That's owned by Google. They own my right to free speech. They can decide. They own all of our rights to free speech. Is that okay? That is simply because they are too big to argue with. And governments like that, as long as they don't go against governments. Then you get this horrible hand-in-hand relationship, this hugger-mugger cooperation between governments and cartel businesses. It's very unattractive. So if you're worried about inequality, about social atomization, and about the size of big business, then employee ownership is the way to go. It's the effective way to deal with it. I have I'll leave a link below to a guide that I wrote as to how to do it. It contains all the necessary legal documents, the template documents you can use if you want to do it. It's interesting in itself if you want to read it. You can use the documents free of charge. I don't want any money for them. You can download them, use them. You do it at your own risk. I won't be liable if it goes wrong, but it's a good thing to look at, a good thing to consider. But my overall point here is that greater equality is impossible under a generous welfare state such as we have today. That's because, well, three things. It correlates with, the welfare state correlates with ever-increasing inequality. It gets the state to adopt measures which themselves indirectly increase inequality, and it prevents us adopting measures which would reduce inequality. Losing the welfare state is likely to be scary. It's a scary prospect for a lot of us, I'm sure, but the potential for life after the welfare state and the state authority is good. Churchill's broad sunlit uplands didn't come after World War II. I think they will come after the end of the state.